Alright, so this is week 3, and going through chapters 7 through 9. So, the most modern type of RAM is SD RAM, and we'll go through the many types of RAM. This will kind of make sense when I say it's technically DRAM, meaning dynamic RAM. So the S means synchronous, meaning that it writes to multiple sides of the RAM at the same time. So the SD RAM uses the clock rate of the physical machine, which is a crystal on the actual motherboard that we went over last week. So the common pin count with SD RAM is 168 pin, whereas laptops are 70 to 144 or 200. So it's kind of important to remember that laptops are always a different pin count. Even if the chip looks like it's the same size, they're always different, and they're usually smaller. So 144 is pretty common. So this is developed by Intel as a faster replacement for SD RAM. And both of these, if you keep in mind, are older. So they're not the most current. So support up to 800 megahertz, which is really slow by today's standards because they run at about 1300 or higher depending on the manufacturer or the exact speed of the RAM. And RAM doesn't actually stand for anything. Just I guess they just like making acronyms for no reason. So it came in two sizes, a 184 and a 164. Laptops, as I said, smaller because they only have so much room in the physical laptop. The location of the slots. So on RAM, there's the pins, and then they have a slot that separates collections of pins. And the little slot between the two determines which types of RAM can fit in each slot. So the motherboards are actually built so that they only fit certain types of RAM. So they do that as a safety measure to make sure that you can't buy the wrong type of RAM and put it in. Now, it's always possible to buy an incorrect speed of RAM that your motherboard can't handle, but you at least can't fit in the wrong type of RAM. And usually, you wouldn't want to anyway. There's no benefit to cramming, an older piece of RAM into a newer PC anyway. So why would you bother? So RDRAM also came with CRIM, which needed to be installed to terminate. So if you didn't use every RAM slot, you had to put what was known as a CRIM into those slots. Otherwise, the RDRAM would not function correctly. I don't know why, but it doesn't. So it's also known as Rambus RAM, which is just a copyright thing that ended up being made. What was the company? I think the company was Rambus, so they actually owned the rights to it. DDR RAM, this is one of the newer ones. So the three newest right now that are most common: DDR RAM, DDR2 RAM, and DDR3 RAM. Technically speaking, the full name is DDR2 SDRAM, DDR SDRAM, and DDR3 SDRAM. So they each have different pin counts, just as the other RAM does, and they only fit in their appropriate slots. So same thing, they have different frequencies available that make them faster or slower, and it just stands for dual channel SDRAM. That's all it is. Nothing too special except that you don't need to buy CRIMs to make it work. It just works. DDR2 and DDR3 are just faster and more capacity crammed into a chip. That's all it is. That's all you need to know is as it increments up, they're just faster, different pin counts, and and they make this joke in the book a lot. It's not going to fit this. You use a hammer to put it in the slot.
Oh, hammer mechanic.
So latency is something you have to worry about a lot. So even if you have the fastest RAM, it claims to be the fastest RAM possible, it could have latency so slow that the slower RAM actually runs quicker and allows you to make your PC quicker using that type of RAM instead. So you have to make sure that the clock cycle delays, which they'll refer to when you're purchasing the RAM, or if you're buying it pre-built, it comes with the RAM. A lot of times they don't, because they put what works with that hardware together in it anyway. So it's not too much of a worry if you're buying them pre-built and that's not your thing to build them. Parity RAM stores an extra bit that the MCC uses to make sure data is correct. This is actually really great because before they had this, you don't have guaranteed good data between the point at which the CPU processes the data and when the RAM actually has the data going between it. So it's kind of like the CRC in Ethernet, where it checks to make sure it's in the same state it was from when it was sent to when it was received. So very, very similar. Parity RAM is now long gone and has been replaced by ECC RAM. It does a lot more than what parity RAM did. It's all right here on these bottom 4 bullet points. Does it all as it's traveling through the MCC and all the other components on the way there. So it's a little slower, but it works much, much better. Not noticeably slower, anyway. So obviously, as we all know, RAM improves the performance of your PC up to a certain point. There's only so much RAM that you really need. In my gaming desktop, I have 24 gigs. I've almost never needed that much. The only time that's really nice is if you like to use virtual machines. You like to emulate servers, maybe you want to make a Minecraft server, or you want to try out Windows Server 2012 and try out a trial on some of that, just to see if you kind of liked it, or just to kind of mess around and get some hands-on. Either way, doesn't matter. RAM is one of the most sensitive components to ESD, so keep that in mind when you're handling it. Make sure you use your anti-static bags and wrist straps just to be careful with that. So the page file you can think of is a file on the hard drive that's used in case the RAM is used up. So if the RAM gets fully utilized, the page file will start getting used by the operating system and the programs that need RAM instead of RAM. Now, the reason this is used after RAM is because it's much slower to use a page file than it is to use the actual RAM itself. So usually it's 1.5 times larger than the actual RAM that you have in your PC. And Windows will automatically allocate this, and it's highly unrecommended to change this because it's smart enough to do it on its own, and it's usually, there isn't a problem with it. You don't have to really worry about it, just know it's there. Now, if you don't have enough RAM, you get disk thrashing, which is going between too much RAM and using the page file. It's really bad for your hard drive, and it also takes a toll on your RAM. You need something, Chris? Or? It's okay.
Show that. Is that purple?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes. No problem.
Sorry for this version.
No, it's okay. Perfect.
Sorry for that.
No, it's fine. Cool. So these are the recommended and minimum requirements. I would know these. Last time I took the tests 2 or 3 years ago, they always tested on this. They tested, I mean, really know this table because they do press upon this. And when you're building these machines, you kind of want to know anyway, or if you're troubleshooting someone's PC and they're kind of having it, it's kind of being slow, it's nice to know what a decent amount of RAM is, what a necessary amount of RAM is for most users and users who are doing some intense activities. So if the person says, I'm rendering some videos and it's really bogging down my PC, I only have 2 gigs of RAM, you're like, well, that's probably why. 2 gigs of RAM is not a whole lot, and video rendering is pretty intense, so you might want to think about upgrading your RAM. And you say, oh, well, I can't really afford that. You'd be like, sorry, you don't really have any other option. You're really out of luck at that point. Ready Boost. This is kind of cool. They developed this with Windows 7 and above, and this is the ability to use USB drives as RAM space. Now, of course, if you think about it, USB drives are completely identical to RAM, with the exception that they're plugged in via USB. So really, the restriction with using a USB drive for RAM is the USB to Northbridge interface itself. So the actual USB protocol is a lot slower than the RAM that goes directly into the motherboard. So that's why you don't want to rely on this to give you a lot of RAM. So it's nice if you can afford RAM and you need a little extra boost. It's not something where you should only buy 2 gigs of RAM and then put a 10 gig USB in, because it's not gonna.
In case your laptop is closed, so still you can save the data in this USB, or same like RAM, you cannot read the data. You must save that file on the USB.
I think you can do both, because I think when you set up Ready Boost, you can set up how much of the USB drive you want to use for Ready Boost. So it should allow you to do both. And if you have enough RAM, you may not even use the USB drive, because there's an order in which it goes. So think of it like this: RAM, Ready Boost, page file. Okay, so if you go through, all of those, then you're using a lot of RAM. Answer? Great. Okay. All right. Serial presence detect. I never got tested on this, but this is kind of one of those, you just kind of know it as you have a little more hands-on. So it's basically the technology that detects whether RAM has been put in or has it been removed. And as you're diagnosing a PC, you'll notice that it automatically does it. Over time, you'll forget what this actually stands for. You probably won't even know SPD anymore. But you'll notice as you're troubleshooting over time that the BIOS will automatically detect, you have a different hard drive, you have more RAM. A lot of times when you take RAM out or you put more RAM in, it'll say, hey, the RAM is different. Then you have to press a key on your keyboard to confirm, yes, I took the RAM out. The reason it prompts is because sometimes RAM fails, and then what you have is, you have less RAM because it failed. So it's basically telling you, hey, you might have RAM sticks that failed. So it's actually a safety measure. It's kind of nice. It's annoying if your RAM didn't fail and it just came unseated or something else funky going on. So there's multiple ways you can test to see if RAM is bad. A lot of times you'll get memory errors when you're booting up a PC, and the best way I can describe this is you'll usually get beep codes or lights on your PC that'll go in a certain pattern, and on the manufacturer's site they'll have a chart that'll show beep codes, like if it's 1 short, 2 long, and then 1 short, it means the stick in slot 1 has failed, or you don't have any RAM in or something. So you can sometimes rely on that. However, if you want to get more granular and find out the exact stick or specific statistics about each one, how fast it is, you can use memtest, free downloadable. You just burn it to a disk or a USB drive, and you can plug it in I would say it takes probably about an hour to run, and you can find out which stick is bad. Alternatively, if you think that one has failed, like if you know that you put 4 gigs of RAM in your computer, and when it's booting up, it says that you only have 3, you might have a bad stick. So what you can do is think of troubleshooting as a process in which you are trying to isolate the problem by keeping as many things constant. So if you have 4 sticks of RAM, you only take out 1 at once. And if the problem still stays there after you take out each one, then you know that the ones you've taken out aren't the bad ones. So you just take one out, put it back in, take one out, put it back in. And you just do that until the air goes away. And then you know that's the bad stick, and you can try to boot it up without that one in. If it boots up, you got bad RAM. So, and if you have bad RAM, there's nothing you can do about it. It's garbage. You can't fix it. It's hardware. There's no software on it. It's just, network or programmable chips, rather. So, with that, going into BIOS now. So there's a chip on your motherboard, and it's really small, like many of the other chips, and it's known as the ROM. And it's known as flash memory, and it can be overwritten, but only with a specific utility that's generally either built into the BIOS, or a lot of manufacturers will build a utility that you can run within Windows that will flash the BIOS. But every time you reboot, it will stay the same as long as there's power provided to it. And the power is provided by that CMOS battery, which is in this slide. So it's literally just a button cell that you'll find in your watch or anything, and that'll last for a pretty long time. A really common way to find out that your CMOS battery has gone bad is you will boot up your machine, and it will reset to the date that it was manufactured or the date that it came off the assembly line. And every time you reboot, it will reset to that time. So, you might be in Central Standard Time, it might be 7 p.m., but it says 11 a.m., and you're like, that's not right. So you set it, then you reboot, and you come back later, it says 11 a.m., you're like, okay, something's going on. My battery might be dead. So you can take it out, use any generic tester. You don't need a fancy one. And then you can find out if it's bad or not. So, so it's able to hold 64 kilobytes, but it only uses around 128 bytes to function. So, technically, the setup utility is known as CMOS. However, as almost every tech will refer to it as, it's just the BIOS, even though technically the BIOS isn't really the setup utility. So there's 2 major companies that you'll see when you're booting up. Earlier on, you would see American Megatrends, and it would say like, energy efficient BIOS or whatever, and it would have like a star at the top. So you would see those. And then there was also Phoenix Technology that did a lot of AMD as well. So Phoenix bought out American, but they kept the branding of both companies. So if you see a really old PC, it's probably before it got bought out. If you see a newer one with it, it's basically the same company, and they'll be pretty identical. So this is an older BIOS, obviously. The background is blue, but it was grayscale in the book. I just copy-pasted it. The most common place you'll end up being is in either advanced BIO features or standard CMOS features. And the reason you'll end up going in there is to change the boot order. So if you want to boot a CD, maybe you have a distribution, like maybe you're installing Windows 7 or you're installing some Linux distribution. You have to change it so that the CD is the first boot disk. Whereas generally the default option is for the hard drive to boot first. A lot of times, what companies will do is they will put a password on the BIOS. and then make the hard drive the first boot device, so that employees, or if it's educational students, don't put in an Ubuntu disk and write over the hard drive. So they can do some security there. However, the way you can get around that is by resetting the CMOS, either by just taking the battery out and unplugging it from the wall, or you can use the CMOS jumper that we talked about last week, I think. Yeah, so you can just use the jumper, and that will reset it, including the password gone, and you can boot into it. But of course, that requires opening it up, and if you're opening it up to begin with, you're probably doing something pretty bad.
Since I'm in Cisco 1, or IT 1, to get into that is F12?
It depends per motherboard. So, the most common ones are F2, delete, and sometimes F12. But I've seen F12 more commonly used for selecting a boot device. So you can override what the boot is by pressing that key. But that's another thing you can get rid of in the CMOS settings.
Mm-hmm.
So, the motherboard intelligent tweaker, also known as MIT, you won't always see it referred to as this. You'll just see it as like performance adjuster or something like that. It depends by manufacturer. But you can change the voltage and settings of the motherboard and CPU from the defaults. I would highly recommend leaving this alone unless you, you really have to know what you're doing. Otherwise, you can really screw things up by going in there. Can't stress enough. So virtualization support, you'll obviously need that if you're running any virtual machines. And VirtualBox and Workstation Pro will, when you try to turn on a virtual machine without that enabled, they'll say, hey, you don't seem to have virtualization support on your motherboard. You'd be like, I'm pretty sure I do. My motherboard's pretty high-end. So you look in there. Usually it's enabled by default, so you probably won't have to worry about it. But it's there. Chassis intrusion detection. Basically, it's just an analog switch on your case that detects when the case has been opened, and all it does is when you boot up the next time after it's been opened, it'll pop up a message saying your computer has been opened, and then you have to go into the BIOS and say, yes, I acknowledge that I opened it or whatever. And generally when you have that on, you have a password on your BIOS so that someone can't go in and get rid of the message. So this is another one of those menus that's kind of nice if you want to disable onboard devices for USB support. So you can also change how SATA performs. So you can make it act like IDE, you can make it act like AHCI, which I'm sure we'll get into in a different chapter. But anyway, pretty much everything you can think of that's attached to the physical motherboard that you would plug into on the back, you can turn off or enable here.
See the old SPIDA before 2009.
This is 2009, and I mean this is pretty universal, so it won't necessarily look exactly like this. But
7, I think, is different completely.
Well, I mean this isn't inside Windows. This is in the CMOS. So as you can see right here, so it'll say like CMOS at the top or whatever, and that's actually inside the BIOS. So yeah, so that is zero, nothing to do with whatever operating system is installed, if any. CMOS is completely independent. It's a chip on the motherboard. Alright, power management. So you kind of want to pick and choose what you want to do with this. So what's kind of nice about power management is that you can basically set up your machine to, like one of the settings is, if my computer loses power unexpectedly, I can either leave it off or power back on immediately. So if you have like a PC that you need on all the time, like a server, you're going to want it to turn back on if it loses power. So if power goes out in your building, you don't have battery backup for some reason, you should always have that on a server at least. Then in case you don't, you definitely want it to come right back up because it's more than likely used for something important. So you want to make sure that these don't conflict with Windows settings. Windows isn't capable of booting up your PC automatically if there's power loss. But you can change things like when it turns off and things like that. So just make sure those don't conflict. Alright. Overclocking. It might be available in the BIOS, but it doesn't mean you can actually do it. You have to have some high-end hardware for this to even really be worth considering. Generally, you buy a CPU that supports this, or one that claims to support it, because you usually know what you're doing if you're going here to begin with, or even thinking about it. You can end up breaking a ton of different things if you do this wrong. It used to be a lot easier to screw things up when it was newer, but now they've made it a little harder to screw things up. A lot of motherboards will actually automatically overclock to a safe level. You basically just tell it, okay, auto overclock to a safe level and manage the fans to keep it cool. So you can really get very granular about how you want things done, or you can just have it manage it. Not all motherboards support that, however, which is why they don't include that automatic overclocking thing.
So it just overheats the CPU and fries it?
If you don't have proper cooling on it, it will overheat and break rapidly if you don't manage the heat correctly. So, take a 10 minute. I kind of need a drink.
Can you just, when you have a chance, I never got that last thing settled. Can I take it back in here now?
Oh, what happened?
I don't know.
Maybe the program froze.
I can't do anything.
I'm trying to reopen the program. Oh, let's stop.
What was that? What was that?
You accidentally minimized it.
But I think I tried that and I don't think that was open either.
So, perhaps 2 minutes.
Oh. Try that. You want me to shut?
Alrighty. Get started again. So, as I mentioned, you can set a password to get into the BIOS, and you can have another one to change settings. Sometimes there's one for both. And occasionally there's a password to even boot up, which is frankly very irritating. And I mean, most of the time, computers don't have locks to keep you from opening them. But I have seen desktop case locks to keep people from opening them before, and they are effective. So, I mean, if you're really insistent on having that. So, this is Trusted Platform Module. So it's a small circuit. It's plugged into the motherboard or built into the motherboard itself. These haven't been used in a while, but you'll see them every now and then with BitLocker to encrypt files. And it's safer than software because it's a physical chip and you're not relying on Windows to be reliable. So, you know, you're not having the possibility of someone, putting a virus on Windows and ending up decrypting all your data just because they hacked into where the key was stored. So that's actually something that's kind of nice if you can hold. So device drivers are stored on the hard drive. Contains all the commands necessary to talk to whatever device it's really support. So there's a driver for pretty much everything from your audio to your video to the mice, everything. It's generally built in for most things, but anything special like a graphics card you buy to add a little beefiness to your PC, that will definitely need a driver from the manufacturer, and they have the newest ones on their website. Never use the ones that they give you on the disc because they are ridiculously outdated. They are like, second revision of what they've ever made for that device.
Mm-hmm.
And they've come out with like 20 versions before you even receive that disc. So it's a waste of your time to even think about putting that in your machine. Unless you don't have access to internet. But, in a degree. So post. This is stored on the ROM chip. And every single time you try to boot up, post will start. And there's like four things it looks for when it's booting up. And I think the next slide handles what those are. But yeah, it just looks for things like, is there a functional keyboard? Is there functional video built in, or a graphics card? And there's some other stuff as well that it checks. Let's see, does it run here? Yeah, so it just checks the hardware. So this is a process. It checks to make sure the CPU is receiving power. That's good. It checks all the hardware. If it passes, it won't create any beeps or any lights. It'll continue on. Sometimes it will create beeps, but it will move on. For non-critical things like maybe you have a server, you don't have a keyboard plugged into it because you access it remotely, but for some reason you had to manually turn it on. So that's not a big deal. Sometimes you get those. So if that passes, it goes onto the bootstrap loader, which is just several lines of code in the post. And all that is the bootstrap loader contains information such as what order to boot things in. So what you set in the CMOS earlier, like I want CD to boot before hard drive to boot before floppy or whatever. So you could have, that's what that is. So it passes it on to bootstrap loader, and at that point post is no longer involved. And bootloader takes over and loads the OS. Once it starts to load the OS, bootloader bootloader is no longer involved. So as it moves down, each process gets left behind because it's no longer needed. So, as I mentioned, CMOS battery, you need that to retain all your settings, your passwords, not passwords for your operating system, just your hardware. And they're cheap, so no worries. And they're not special, they're just literally watch batteries. If someone ever tells you, yeah, this is the special CMOS battery, they're full of it, so don't listen to them. So UEFI is the new technology, and you can kind of tell the difference usually visually before even functionality. UEFI is a lot prettier. It has a lot more visual features to it. BIOS is functional and it looks ugly as heck. It's been around forever, but it works still. So if you see one with BIOS, it's not wrong. It's not outdated to the point where you can't use it, but you know, it's kind of being phased out. You'll literally see new PCs have UEFI BIOSes. However, they will support operating systems that only support BIOS. So it's backwards compatible, but almost all operating systems moving forward support UEFI. So it's not anything that you really have to worry about as far as compatibility goes. It's just this is newer, it supports newer technology. It's nice to have. So if you see a computer that supports it, that's great. So motherboards. Motherboard basics. So literally everything plugs into this, and it all branches out from the motherboard itself. Everything plugs into it at some point or another. So everything from the power supply to the hard drive to the CD drive, everything. And it distributes the power and all the data. It's actually kind of awesome. So ATX form factor was created in 1995, taking over the original AT, which was in 98. I've actually seen the AT form in my old Xbox. That was kind of cool. Because you never see those. But they didn't need anything fancy in those. It's just they wanted the bare metal, whatever was cheapest and worked the best. So that was it. And ATX is very common because towers are still rather large. So there's no need to really worry about getting the smallest one if you have a giant tower anyway. It's kind of nice if you're trying to keep your tower a little neater, but that's really it. The only thing you really have to worry about is having a smaller tower with a motherboard that's too big. So you have to kind of make sure that you read the specifications for your case. You can only buy this big of a motherboard. You can only put these many hard drives in it, so on. So a smaller form factor is known as micro ATX. So it's 30% smaller and measures 9.6 by 9.6. I don't think you'll need to know the actual specifications, like as far as measurements. Just know that it's smaller. So the next one is known as ITX, and it's not really popular, but there's like variations of it, kind of like USB, that are popular, such as Mini ITX, Nano, and Pico ITX, and they all kind of get sequentially smaller. The most common is Mini ITX. You'll see Nano and Pico, unlike really mini PCs. I mean, they're like this big. They're tiny. They're like the size of Raspberry Pis, essentially. Mini ITXs are probably about this big by this big. So they're really small. They're really nice if you can afford the CPU that goes along with it.
People use my notes.
There you go. Fun fact of the day.
Mm-hmm. That was pretty lovely. I'm not charging.
Good, because I'm letting you in here. So proprietary form factors. It's just hardware that's created to function only with hardware developed by the same manufacturer that created that. So this isn't necessarily true with HP or Dell, but the idea is that, you know, there's some hardware that only works with, you know, the people that made the other hardware. So that's all it is. A lot of annoying things that commonly happen, especially in the commercial environment, is that to give you support for the actual hardware and software itself, they won't give it to you unless they install it and put everything together themselves, because they want everything to be done exactly the way they want it. You know, instead of telling people this is how we want it done, and then, you know, the company maybe does it the right way, or they do it a little differently because they disagree with the process. You know, so they really drive us nuts because it's really expensive to have them come out, you know, thousands of dollars just to do something that we could do in a day, and, you know, it only costs us like $100.
Mm.
You know, pay some intern to do it. So the chipset, you'll commonly hear like 32-bit or 64-bit. This is kind of what supports those CPUs. Without this, the CPU would have zero functionality on the actual motherboard itself. It wouldn't be able to do anything. So it's kind of a integrated chip on the motherboard that just allows the CPU to interface correctly with the motherboard. And then kind of a different way of saying it, it just determines what type of CPU it can use and what devices it will support. So this is important. The North Bridge and the South Bridge can commonly get confused. Just know that the North Bridge is between the CPU and the RAM, and sometimes the CPU can interact directly, but most of the time it's through the North Bridge. So the South Bridge handles expansion devices. So if you plug a graphics card or like an Ethernet card into your PC, that goes through the South Bridge. All of that data and power goes through the South Bridge. So they also developed the Super I/O chip, input-output chip, that performed that for extra performance when necessary. So RAID stands for Redundant Array of Independent Disks. Most motherboards support it. I don't know why they said most, because mine doesn't know. It's rather new, probably about a year old. But regardless of your motherboard supporting it, Windows has built-in features to allow you to do RAID 0 and RAID 1. So you can do software RAID even if you can't do hardware RAID. So hardware RAID is what they're talking about here, but software RAID you can always do on Windows. And usually most OSs will allow you to do it. PCI, Peripheral Component Interconnect. This is actually covered pretty extensively in these chapters. It goes between, because PCI has developed a lot over the years. It used to be 32 bits wide, which is slow and very, very wide. So the nice thing is that manufacturers put a lot of these PCI slots in, different variations, not actual PCI anymore. So the newer one, called AJP, only for video cards. It's generally a brown color and has this little white spacer there. You can't take it out and use it for something else. It's literally built into that. PCI.
Why is it connected to North Bridge, not South Bridge?
No, these are South Bridge.
Oh.
These are South Bridge. North Bridge is CPU and RAM. That's all it is.
Can you just go back to the last slide?
Yes.
With the direct connection to the North Bridge.
Oh. I don't know why. To be honest. You don't see this anymore, though. This is an old technology. They specifically kept those apart because they want to make sure that the CPU and the RAM aren't slowed down by any things that you may put in there to expand. Yeah, so maybe I made a typo, I'm not sure. PCIX, it's another technology that's old and outdated. It's no longer used. Maybe you'll see it in a really old computer, but it's there.
I have it at my house.
PCI Express is the latest and fastest, also known as PCIe. This one is nice because it's small and fast, so rather nice. This one apparently also goes to the North Bridge. Other devices to finish communicating with the CPU. Okay. Yeah, so pretty self-explanatory. So original PCI used parallel communication, whereas this uses serial communication, which is faster and more direct. This one you'll see mostly with video cards. Generally it has a little tab that clicks when you push it in. You have to push it rather straight in, otherwise it won't work. And these are very, very common today with brand new cards and older cards as well. So this is also considered PCIe. It's just a 16-lane version. So it's just longer. So this is the process of determining if your expansion card can fit and actually putting it in to begin with. So knowledge. This is making sure it actually works with it before you even buy it. Unless you already have it laying around, in which case, you still have to make sure it fits, but that's usually a 15 minutes. You go to the manufacturer's site and you see, do they support this type? Or you just open it up, and if you have enough knowledge, you know what each card looks like, and they only fit in the slot they're designed to fit in. So, worst case scenario, you sit there with the card and it doesn't fit in any of them, so you don't even need to look it up really. Most of them aren't backwards compatible, so you don't have to really worry about that. But if you're buying it, then you won't know until you get it, so research is important. Physical install, one of the most important things, obviously avoid ESD, but also pressing the card straight in. I don't know why this is so hard to grasp upon, but literally just push it straight in, no angles or anything, and then you screw it in, using a screw in the end of it where everything plugs in. And never have it on when you do that. Right. Once again, I don't know how people come up with that, but it happens. So device drivers, talked about it before. They're either loaded on the optical disc or from the manufacturer's site, and always after it's installed, because usually the device driver software or the driver itself won't install unless it detects a device that will be compatible with that driver. Okay, unsigned drivers. So they're not tested by Microsoft to be functional with Windows. However, they could still work. So a lot of times you'll see a message pops up, giant red box. Does not necessarily mean it won't work. It just means they haven't tested it. Microsoft hasn't tested it. The manufacturer most likely did. So it doesn't mean it won't work. Just know. Driver rollback means you can roll back to an older version if you're updating the driver. Generally, you won't update the driver unless the manufacturer says, hey, there's a security bug in it that we didn't see before. This is to patch it. Or, here's a fix for the bug for this thing that's not working. But you won't just say, hey, I'm going to go see if there's new drivers just because. Because it's unnecessary and kind of pointless. So, verify stage, just making sure that it shows it as installed or if it doesn't, then you'll see common symbols such as an exclamation point or a giant X going over the symbol next to the device's name. And they symbolize either that the device isn't functioning correctly, or like there's not a like the incorrect drivers installed or something like that. So, or the X symbolizes disabled. So, definitely read this before you even start putting the motherboard in, or if you bought it as like a pre-built thing, make sure you read this. It's just nice because when you actually need to work on it, you already know where everything is. So it's nice to know before you need it. So they kind of combine this into a little, like the same idea. So when you're putting it in, there's multiple things you need to determine. So as we said before, the size of the physical motherboard. And you're also taking out any cards if you're replacing it. And unplugging any cables and putting it directly into an anti-static bag. So after you put it back in, just hook everything up. So power, hard drives, optical drives, and everything else, RAM. Now this is where you're going to need the manual. You have all these plugs and all these cables going in, and they don't always label them on the physical board because there's so many cables it's impossible to label them exactly as they need to go. So you just check the manual. They'll show you the orientation of components on the board. You just turn your manual, and then you just take your cables, plug them in. Sometimes the polarity matters, sometimes it doesn't. So if it doesn't work right away, just flip the cable around using the same pins. It doesn't break anything if you flipped it the wrong way. Just so you know. Usually these cables are for things such as USB ports in the front, the power button, the power light, hard drive light. If you have like headphone or microphone jacks in the front, they're never for anything in the back. It's always functionality in the front of the case. So, just as anything, just take it one thing at a time. Obviously don't get overwhelmed with it because it's each component in itself is very simple. So just kind of keep in mind what the possible causes are. And if you can't figure it out, there's tons and tons of forums out there that you can reach out to people about that will be more than glad to help you. Some people, it's like all they do. They literally have a job to sit there and watch for people having problems. So, especially if you've changed anything recently, try to change it back and see if the problem stops. So, a lot of times what happens when you're installing like a video card or like a Ethernet card, if it doesn't work or it's stopped working after it's been plugged in for quite a while, you can just try reseating the device, or you can even try to clean the contacts. Don't use rubbing alcohol or, God forbid, soap. Just take a cloth, like a microfiber cloth, and wipe it off. Don't use paper towel because it has little fibers on it that'll get on the contacts. Or if you have like those little cloths they use to clean glasses, basically, those work well too. So you'd be surprised how many times reseating it just works magic for absolutely no reason at all. But who knows, maybe it gets bumped and then it shakes a little bit over time. I don't know. Questions?
See you next week.
Sounds great.
Have a good weekend.
Yes.
Yeah. Awesome. Let me see if
Can
there's...
you send me? What's your slides? Did you send me them? Or can you?